She extended a hand of mercy to a dying man, a ghost of the desert wind. The next dawn, the very ground around her home trembled with the silent tread of his kin, a circle of shadows closing in. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from, and subscribe if you want more content like this one. The dust on the horizon was not a cloud, but a memory, an invisible scar that stretched across Ilara's parched land. Her homestead, a defiant whisper against the vast, indifferent expanse, stood alone under a sun that baked the very air into a brittle silence. For years she had wrestled with the earth, pulling sustenance from its stubborn grasp, her days a monotonous symphony of toil and solitude. The closest settlement was a day's ride, a place she rarely visited, for its whispers carried the weight of judgment and a past she had fled, though it clung to her like the desert's fine grit. Her hands, calloused and strong, bore the marks of a life lived without softness, without a forgiving touch. Each evening, as the sun bled into the western sky, painting the clouds in hues of fiery resignation, Ilara would sit on her porch, the rifle across her lap, watching, not for beauty but for shadows that moved too quickly, for disturbances in the unyielding calm. It was a vigilance born of bitter experience, a knowledge that the fragile peace of the frontier was a thin veneer over a simmering, ancient conflict. This land had claimed much from her, leaving behind only the stark landscape and a pervasive emptiness that no amount of hard work could fill. It had stripped away illusions, leaving behind only the stark truth of survival. There was a story in the lines around her eyes, a narrative of loss and resilience that no one in the distant town could ever truly comprehend, nor would they try. They saw only the outsider, the woman who chose isolation, not realizing it was isolation that had chosen her, a refuge from the unforgiving gaze of a judgmental world. Every creak of the old house, every rustle of the dry brush, was amplified by the vast quiet, each sound a potential harbinger of something unseen, something dangerous, or perhaps something that demanded a reckoning. One sweltering afternoon, a flicker of movement near the dry riverbed caught her eye. It wasn't the familiar dart of a jackrabbit or the lazy drift of a hawk. This was something larger, hunched, a form that seemed to writhe against the shimmering heat haze. Ilara gripped her rifle, her heart a drum against her ribs, a rhythm she knew too well. As she drew closer, the figure resolved into a man, a Native American warrior, his skin sun-baked and taut over gaunt bones, his face etched with a pain that transcended tribal lines. He was wounded. A crude bandage around his leg stained dark, his breath ragged, each gasp a desperate plea against the encroaching silence of death. His eyes, though clouded with fever, held a stark primal intelligence, a desperate ember in a dying fire. A wave of revulsion, ancient and deeply ingrained, threatened to pull Ilara back. Years of frontier warnings, of whispered tales of savagery, of personal scars that mirrored the land's brutal history, surged within her. To aid an Apache was to betray everything her community stood for, everything she had been taught to believe. It was to invite peril, perhaps even death, into her already precarious existence. Yet something in the raw vulnerability of his suffering, the sheer animal desperation of his fight for breath, pierced through the layers of her hardened exterior. It was a moment of profound, unsettling humanity, a mirror reflecting the fragile line between predator and prey, between life and oblivion, that she herself walked every day. A single, parched leather pouch lay beside him, a cruel irony in the desert's embrace. He looked up at her, not with defiance but with an agonizing, silent request. His tongue was thick, cracked, a stark image of the thirst that consumed him. The choice was not between right and wrong, but between life and the crushing weight of her own conscience. The small tin cup filled with water drawn from her precious well trembled slightly in her hand as she extended it. His eyes, hollowed by fever, fixated on the shimmering liquid. He took it, his fingers brushing hers, a touch surprisingly light, almost ghost-like, yet sending a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with fear. He drank, slow and deliberate, each swallow a testament to the agony of his thirst. A faint sigh, almost imperceptible, escaped him. Ilara watched, a silent observer to this primal act of survival, her own breath held. She knew with chilling certainty that this act, this fleeting moment of unbidden mercy, had irrevocably altered the landscape of her life. It was a pebble dropped into still water, and the ripples would soon reach her distant shores. As the last drop vanished, his gaze, clearer now, met hers. There was no gratitude, no animosity, only a profound, silent acknowledgement. He simply nodded, a slow, deliberate movement that carried the weight of ancient custom. He then pointed to the sun, indicating its descent, and then to the east, a clear signal. He would be gone by morning. Ilara watched him struggle to his feet, a gaunt, defiant silhouette against the fiery sunset. He vanished into the deepening shadows of the arroyo as silently as he had appeared, leaving behind only the dust his passing had stirred and the unsettling silence of her own actions. The air grew heavy, not with the chill of evening, but with the unspoken question of what she had done and what the dawn would bring. A gnawing unease settled deep within her, a premonition that the quiet exchange of water for a silent nod was merely the prelude to a much larger, more complex reckoning. Sleep that night was a fractured landscape of uneasy dreams and the constant whisper of the wind, each gust sounding like a question she could not answer. The first rays of dawn, usually a welcome herald of another day's hard work, seemed to Ilara like the ominous glow of a distant fire. She rose before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, the gnawing anxiety of the night still clinging to her like a shroud. A quick glance out her window sent a fresh wave of dread through her very bones. They were there. Not one, not two, but a silent multitude of figures etched against the pale morning light, forming a wide, unbroken circle around her small homestead. Apache warriors, their faces stoic, their movements deliberate, silent as the shadows they cast. Their presence was a palpable weight in the stillness, a heavy blanket of unspoken intent that pressed down on her isolated home. It was not the chaotic, war-painted rush of a raid, but a chilling, disciplined encirclement. Their numbers were impossible to discern precisely, blending with the distant scrubland, yet their collective presence felt vast, insurmountable. Each warrior was a dark, unmoving sentinel, a silent testament to the desert's unforgiving laws. Their spears, or perhaps rifles, glinted faintly in the burgeoning light, sharp needles of light that seemed to pierce the very air. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Her breath hitched. The image of the dying man from yesterday, his desperate thirst, flashed before her eyes. Had her act of mercy been a fatal mistake? Had she, in her fleeting moment of compassion, simply drawn a larger, more formidable threat to her doorstep? The silence was the most terrifying aspect, an absence of sound that amplified the pounding of her own blood in her ears. It was a silence filled with questions, with unspoken power, with the chilling potential of what might come next. The sun climbed higher, washing the landscape in a stark, unforgiving light, revealing every detail of their unwavering presence. A distant memory, sharp and unwelcome, cut through Ilara's terror like a shard of glass. A flicker of faded linen, a child's laugh abruptly cut short, the metallic tang of smoke. It was a day much like this, perhaps a decade ago, when the whispers of a different raid had echoed across the plains, whispers that had quickly solidified into the brutal, undeniable truth of ash and blood. Her sister, young and vibrant, full of life's promise, had been taken, not by the Apache but by a different tribe, or so the townspeople had sworn. The details were blurred by the shock of grief, but the image of her parents' haunted eyes, the unanswerable questions remained. Her father, a man once sturdy and resolute, had withered under the weight of that loss, his spirit broken, his body soon to follow. He had often spoken of the savages, a term spit with venom, of their inherent cruelty, their untamed nature. His words had been hammered into Ilara's mind, creating a deep-seated distrust, a wall against anything that hinted at the other. She had been a girl then, small and helpless, watching her world crumble. Now standing alone in her cabin, surrounded by the silent, watchful eyes of another tribe, those old wounds festered anew. The irony was a bitter taste in her mouth. She had defied the ingrained prejudice, offered kindness to a suffering man, and in doing so, perhaps invited the very destruction she had spent a lifetime guarding against. The desert, unforgiving and indifferent, seemed to mock her fragile humanity. The memory wasn't a mere recollection. It was a physical weight pressing down on her, a chilling reminder of the cyclical nature of conflict and the personal cost of the vast, simmering tensions between the two worlds. It was the genesis of her isolation, the root of her fear, a profound understanding of the unpredictable brutality that lurked beneath the frontier's thin crust. Hours crawled by, each minute stretching into an eternity. The sun climbed, then began its slow descent, painting the sky in fiery hues that belied the chilling stillness on the ground. The warriors remained, unmoving, their patience an unsettling force. Ilara watched them from behind her dusty windowpane, her rifle clutched tightly, its cold steel a familiar comfort against her trembling hands. The air grew heavy, not with the oppressive heat, but with the unspoken question of their intent. Then, a single figure detached itself from the silent circle, moving with a deliberate, unhurried pace towards her cabin. It was the same man she had given water to, his limp less pronounced, his eyes now clear and focused, holding a gaze of unwavering intensity. He stopped a few yards from her door, his hands open, empty, a gesture of non-aggression, yet his stillness spoke of immense power. Ilara hesitated, her mind a maelstrom of conflicting instincts. To open the door was to invite the unknown. To refuse was to prolong this unbearable tension, perhaps provoke the very confrontation she dreaded. After a long, agonizing moment, a decision formed, cold and resolute. She lowered her rifle, though she kept it within reach, and slowly, deliberately, unbarred the heavy wooden door. The creak of the hinges echoed in the profound silence, a sound of profound consequence. Their eyes met across the threshold, a chasm of cultural difference, of suspicion, of history. His face remained impassive, betraying nothing, yet there was a flicker, a brief, almost imperceptible shift in the depths of his gaze that spoke of something beyond simple gratitude. It was a profound, almost ancient recognition, a silent acknowledgement of a debt incurred and a reckoning underway. He remained silent, allowing the weight of the moment to settle, his very presence a question, a statement, and a challenge all at once. Just as the standoff silence was nearing its breaking point, a different kind of disturbance rippled through the dusty air. The distant clang of metal on rock, the murmur of agitated voices growing louder, more distinct. It was the townsfolk. A group of them, led by Silas Thorne, the self-appointed elder of the nearby settlement, a man whose piety was as loud as his prejudices. They rode in a loose, unorganized cluster, armed with shotguns and fear, their faces hardened by years of ingrained distrust and fueled by the rumor that had surely spread like wildfire across the plains. "Ilara!" Silas's voice boomed, sharp with alarm and self-righteous indignation. "What in God's name is going on here? We saw the smoke, we heard." He gestured vaguely at the silent Apache, his face contorted in a mix of fear and anger. His words were a crude axe, hacking at the delicate tension that held the two worlds apart. The warriors who had remained impassive now shifted, their gaze turning towards the interlopers, their hands subtly moving towards their weapons. The fragile balance Ilara had painstakingly maintained for hours threatened to shatter. Silas and his men, embodying the very stereotypes the land had forged, narrow-minded, quick to violence, blinded by their own fear, saw only a threat, a chance to prove their perceived dominance. They were not here to help Ilara, but to enforce their own crude version of order, to confront what they deemed savage. "They've got her surrounded," a younger man shouted, his voice cracking with fear. "Likely to be a massacre." Ilara stepped forward, placing herself between the two groups, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Silas, stand down," she commanded, her voice surprisingly steady despite the turmoil within her. "This is not what it seems." But her words were barely a whisper against the rising tide of fear and prejudice, a futile attempt to bridge a gap that generations of animosity had carved deep into the unforgiving land. The air crackled with the imminent threat of bloodshed, a tension so thick it tasted of iron and dust. The weight of their collective gaze, both from the silent Apache and the agitated townsfolk, pressed down on Ilara, a crucible forging a desperate choice. Silas Thorne, his face red with a mixture of fear and self-importance, ignored her plea. "We ain't standing down, woman. These heathens mean trouble. We're here to protect our own." His hand moved towards the rifle slung across his saddle. The Apache warrior, the man she had helped, took a slow, deliberate step forward, his gaze never leaving Silas. His voice, when it finally came, was deep, resonant, and though guttural, surprisingly clear. "She gave me water," he stated, his words cutting through the tense air like a sharpened blade, a simple declaration that held immense weight. "My people honor kindness." His words were not a request, but a statement of ancient law, a tradition that stood in stark contrast to the townsfolk's immediate aggression. A collective murmur rippled through the Apache ranks, a confirmation of his words. Silas, momentarily stunned by the warrior's unexpected pronouncement, hesitated, his hand hovering over his weapon. It was clear he had not anticipated this. Ilara seized the moment. "They mean us no harm, Silas. He sought aid, and I gave it. This is a council, not a siege." She knew she was gambling, risking everything on the hope that his words were true, that ancient customs of reciprocity held sway over the volatile prejudices of both sides. Her own past, the deep-seated fear born of her sister's disappearance, screamed at her to choose the path of aggression, of self-preservation above all else. But the image of the warrior's parched face, the desperate glint in his eyes, solidified her resolve. This was her land, her home, and she would not let fear dictate the outcome. The moral ambiguity of her situation was no longer a question. It was a stark, undeniable truth. To protect the Apache was to defy her own people. To side with her people was to betray the fragile truce she had just forged. The standoff stretched, each breath held, until the Apache warrior, the one Ilara had aided, moved again, this time towards the center of the clearing. He raised his hand, not in threat, but in a gesture that seemed to halt time itself. He began to speak, his voice gaining resonance, weaving a narrative that was both deeply personal and profoundly communal. He spoke of a fever that had consumed his people, a silent predator stalking their camps, claiming the weak and the strong alike. He spoke of journeying alone, in desperation, seeking knowledge, seeking a cure, for his own child lay dying. He spoke of being found by Ilara, a woman of the earth, who had offered life where only death seemed to linger. His words, though delivered in a language largely unknown to the townsfolk, carried the undeniable weight of truth, translated in the raw emotion of his tone, the stark honesty in his eyes. He revealed that he was not a warrior on a raid, but a healer, a seeker of remedies, a father consumed by a paternal grief that transcended cultural boundaries. His tribe, he explained, had followed his trail, fearing him lost, their initial encirclement born of concern, not aggression, and then a profound sense of awe upon finding him alive at the homestead of a white woman. This revelation struck Ilara with the force of a physical blow. Her assumptions, her ingrained fears, the very foundation of her worldview, shattered. He had not come to raid, but to heal. Her simple act of mercy, born of instinct, had been a crucial intervention in a much larger, more tragic struggle. The memory of her sister, the festering wound of her past, shifted, morphing from a source of vengeance into a profound empathy for a suffering father. The irony was devastatingly poignant. The savage she had feared was a mirror of her own deepest human pain. This man, a stranger, had unknowingly challenged every deeply held prejudice she harbored, forcing her to confront the brutal simplicity of shared humanity. The air, once thick with tension, began to shimmer with a different kind of energy. Revelation. The warrior's words, translated piecemeal by an older, more understanding Apache, slowly permeated the townsfolk's rigid fear. Silas Thorne, his face now a mask of confusion rather than anger, lowered his rifle, the weight of his own prejudiced assumptions heavy in his hands. The truth, stark and unadorned, hung in the silence. Ilara, watching the townsfolk's reactions, felt a profound weariness, a deep ache in her bones that was not from physical exertion, but from the immense emotional weight of the confrontation. The emotional climax was not a burst of violence, but a quiet, shattering realization, not only for the townsfolk, but for Ilara herself. Her deeply flawed perception of the world, painted in stark black and white, crumbled before the nuanced colors of shared humanity. The savages were fathers and healers, burdened by their own struggles. The white settlers were capable of both fear and perhaps grudging understanding. This moment, born of a simple act of compassion, had pulled back the veil on the complex tapestry of the frontier, revealing the interwoven threads of grief, hope, and desperate survival that bound them all. The warrior, having delivered his truth, turned his gaze back to Alara, a silent gesture of profound, unspoken gratitude. There was no need for words. The understanding passed between them, a bridge built on a cup of water, and a shared moment of stark vulnerability. It was a fragile bridge, yes, but it was there. And in that moment, for Alara, the world, once a place of stark boundaries, blurred into something new, something hopeful, a landscape where empathy could perhaps truly take root. The bitter taste of her past, though still present, was diluted by the unexpected sweetness of a truth revealed, of a common ground discovered in the most unlikely of circumstances. The sun, now arcing high in the sky, cast long, shifting shadows across the cleared ground. The townsfolk, chastened and subdued, slowly began to disperse, their whispers softer now, tinged with a reluctant respect rather than open hostility. Silas Thorne offered Alara a curt, almost embarrassed nod before turning his horse. The collective shame of their hasty judgment hung in the air, a silent acknowledgement of their own narrow-mindedness. The Apache warriors, their mission of locating their healer brother complete, prepared to depart, their movements now purposeful, unburdened by tension. They mounted their horses, a disciplined, silent exodus that felt profoundly different from their arrival. The man Alara had helped paused, looking back at her one last time. This time his gaze held something akin to a promise, a silent understanding that transcended language. He did not speak, but merely inclined his head, a gesture heavy with meaning before turning and vanishing with his people into the shimmering heat haze of the vast plains. Alara stood alone on her porch, the silence of the desert once again settling around her. But it was a different kind of silence now. It was no longer empty or menacing, but imbued with the echo of shared humanity, of a moment where two worlds had brushed against each other and, against all odds, had found common ground. The weight of her past, the loss of her sister, still lingered, a phantom limb, but the bitterness had softened, replaced by a profound, if melancholic, sense of hope. The frontier had always been a place of harsh lessons, but today it had offered a lesson in connection, a reminder that even in the most desolate landscapes, the seeds of understanding could be sown. Her isolation remained, yet it was no longer a prison, but a chosen sanctuary, a place where the human heart, stripped bare, could find unexpected strength and perhaps a deeper purpose beyond mere survival. The lines on her face, once etched by hardship, now seemed to carry the quiet wisdom of a profound, transformative experience. As the last dust from the departing Apache faded into the distant horizon, Alara walked out into her small, sun-baked yard. She picked up a handful of earth, letting the fine, warm dust sift through her fingers. The land remained, indifferent and unchanging, yet everything felt profoundly altered. The old fears, once rigid as granite, now seemed malleable, susceptible to the gentle erosion of truth. The memory of the warrior's parched tongue, his silent plea for life, was no longer a source of dread, but a symbol of a deeper, universal thirst for connection, for understanding. The incident, a stark and brutal lesson, had reshaped her very essence. It was a testament to the fragile yet enduring nature of humanity, a quiet echo of the truth that compassion, however small, could ripple outwards to dislodge the deepest roots of prejudice. Her homestead, once a fortress against an imagined enemy, now felt like a beacon, a place where a bridge had been built, however fleetingly, across a chasm of misunderstanding. She looked towards the horizon, where the sun, a fiery disk, began its slow descent, painting the sky in the very colors of the dramatic and tense confrontation that had just unfolded. The scar of her past, the wound of her sister's disappearance, had found an unexpected counterpoint in the shared vulnerability of another father's pain. The future of the frontier remained uncertain, a vast open loop of unresolved conflicts and unspoken promises. But for Alara, the narrative had shifted. The darkness had been pierced by a glimmer of hope, a fragile seed planted in the harsh soil of the desert, and as the stars began to prickle through the deepening indigo, each distant light a silent witness, she knew that some debts, forged not in gold but in water, could change the course of a life or perhaps even the very landscape of a heart. The quiet courage of a single act of kindness in a world steeped in animosity could become the most powerful weapon of all.